Hello, everyone. Professor Kruzlik here. So we talked a bit about direct democracy in class, but didn't really have the opportunity to dig into it. So I just wanted to make a short video, making sure we were all on the same page. Oftentimes, when we think about democracy, or we ask what is democracy, or we have a discussion about democracy, we oftentimes think about voting for representatives, or when we think about elections in a democracy, we think about a representative democracy. We think about decisions that we make to vote for people who make decisions on our behalf. But in some systems and some instances, importantly, citizens don't just elect their leaders, but we can vote directly on policies themselves. And so when we hear this idea of direct democracy, this is what we're talking about, that we can actually vote on policies themselves, not just voting for elected officials who would then govern, pass public policy on our behalf. So when we think of what is direct democracy, it refers to institutional arrangements where citizens themselves get to make public policy decisions rather than delegating the authority to elected officials. It doesn't mean every decision in society is made up by a popular vote, but it means some decisions are given to the citizens themselves. So we can see this through referendums, or as our textbook talked about, with initiatives. A referendum, if you are if you voted before, maybe you voted in a referendum. If you followed politics for a few years now, maybe you've encountered referendums or heard of referendums in the US. And so a referendum is when the government puts a specific policy question to voters to vote on. For example, a constitutional amendment or a major issue might be decided through a popular vote. An initiative, by contrast, allows citizens themselves to propose a law or a policy and place it on the ballot, usually after collecting a required number of signatures. So when we think of direct democracy, you may have encountered this before with tax increases. So the question came on the ballot of, do you want to have this small tax increase to maybe pay for schools, a levy for schools, or minimum wage increases? Some states have had abortion access on the ballots, others have had marijuana legalization on the ballot. These are examples of where citizens can actually choose and shape public policy directly instead of representatives working through the legislature, going through the executive branch to pass policy. Instead, voters themselves get to decide on, do we think marijuana legalization should be in this state? Do we think the minimum wage should be higher? Do we think the minimum wage should be this or that? So again, it's this way that citizens can make their voices heard and governments can respond to the direct preferences of citizens. So we know this occurs within and outside the United States. Our textbook uses the example of Switzerland, which has one of the most extensive systems of direct democracy in the entire world. Swiss citizens regularly vote on national referendums, sometimes multiple times per year, on issues ranging from immigration policy to taxation. Direct democracy here in Switzerland is built into the political system and is considered a normal part of governance. So again, in the United States, like I said, direct democracy does exist, maybe not to the same extent as in Switzerland, but we see it at state and local levels. Not so much at the national level, but definitely at the state and even more localized levels. States like California make pretty frequent use of ballot initiatives, pretty frequent uses of ballot referendums. We've seen California voters decide on issues like tax limits, um, um, higher taxes on wealthier individuals, marijuana legalization. A famous one a couple years ago was criminal justice reform. These were all put directly on the ballot, directly at the ballot box. Citizens were able to decide, do we want this policy to occur? So direct democracy is used occasionally, of course, in other countries as well. A textbook gives the example of the UK's Brexit referendum in 2016, where voters were asked directly whether the UK should remain in or leave the European Union. The result of leave had massive political and economic consequences, economic ramifications. So big decisions that went directly to voters. Should the UK leave the European Union? So big question, big repercussions. So we can think of, why would a democracy use direct democracy? It does have some advantages and some drawbacks. So one of the main advantages is that it increases political participation. Citizens are not just choosing leaders, they are actively shaping public policy. This can enhance the legitimacy, something we hear a lot about in political science, can enhance the legitimacy of decisions because outcomes reflect the direct will of the people. Direct democracy can also serve as a check on political elites. If citizens feel that representatives are not responding to public preferences, direct voting mechanisms allow them to bypass traditional institutions and act directly. However, there are some drawbacks. Like everything that we think about when with elections and voting and just how to govern, there are either unintended consequences or simply just drawbacks. One of the most glaring and easy to understand concern is that policy issues are oftentimes complex, and voters may not always have the time, something that we brought up in class, or information, something else we brought up in class, needed to fully understand the decisions that they are making. Campaigns around referendums may and can simplify issues or rely on emotional appeals rather than careful deliberation. So citizens may not fully understand or fully appreciate the consequences of their votes. Doesn't mean direct democracy is bad, but when we think of how do we govern, this is a concern that we think about. Another issue with direct democracy is that it can be influenced by money and interest groups. So in places like California, well-funded groups can and oftentimes do shape ballot initiatives through advertising and through messaging, raising questions about whether outcomes truly reflect the public interest. There's also the risk of majority role overriding minority rights. Because decisions are made by popular vote, there are fewer institutional protections compared to representative systems, where courts and legislatures can act as safeguards. Finally, Finally, direct democracy can produce unintended consequences. The Brexit vote, that again our textbook uses as an example, revealed that a single referendum can trigger long-term political and economic uncertainty, especially when the implications of the decisions are not fully clear at the time of voting. So when we think about how should we consider the pros and the cons of direct democracy, at its best, it deepens democratic participation and legitimacy. But at its worst, it can lead to poorly informed decisions, elite manipulation, or unstable policy outcomes. So our key takeaways when we think about direct democracy is that direct democracy is not necessarily a replacement for representative institutions. It is a supplement. And like all democratic tools, its effectiveness depends on how it is designed and used. An example I oftentimes use in class is foreign policy decisions, where when we think about if people had the opportunity and the responsibility to vote for and vote on every single foreign policy decision, not only would Americans tire of having to vote, which we know voter fatigue is a real thing, but also how would they have access to the same amount of information that policymakers do? So that's not to say direct democracy is good or direct democracy is bad. But when we think about the complexity of a contemporary society, maybe there is a role for direct democracy in some places, but not others. Thank you.